The great bells of Valmir rang at dawn, summoning every soul to the palace square. King Alden stood upon his golden balcony, his robes glittering like molten sun, declaring that from this day forward, all gold in the kingdom would belong to him alone. His voice carried both thunder and pride, echoing through the streets like judgment. Below, merchants froze, mothers clutched their coins, and beggars wept in silence. And in his eyes burned hunger, not for survival, but for dominion. "What happens?" the whispering crowd asked, "when a lie becomes the only truth you live in?" The king smiled, believing himself eternal, blind to the storm of fate already rising behind him. For in the shadow of the square, one ragged beggar raised his head and smiled back. "Is wealth worth losing your soul or your peace?" By noon, Valmir's markets had fallen silent. Gold vanished from merchant stalls, wagons, and homes. Even wedding rings were taken. King Alden watched from his throne, his lips curling into a satisfied smile as guards brought sack after sack before him. Yet, as the coins poured in, the sound that once thrilled him began to feel hollow. Queen Maria stood beside him, her eyes on the window where peasants wept outside the gates. "Do you hear them?" she whispered. "That is the sound of hunger." But Alden ignored her words. His heart had turned into a vault, locked, heavy, and echoing with emptiness. Outside the palace walls, Elias sat cross-legged beside an empty fountain, his worn hands cupping a single coin. People passed him in fear. None dared to hold gold anymore. Yet Elias smiled, whispering softly to a child who stared at the coin. "This is not gold," he said. "This is memory. It buys nothing, but it teaches everything." The child nodded, eyes wide. A soldier saw them, frowning, and walked away uneasily. The beggar's calm was strange, dangerous like a flame hidden under ashes. When word reached the palace that a beggar refused to surrender his coin, King Alden's face hardened. "Bring him to me," he ordered. Captain Thorne hesitated for a moment, then bowed. "Your Majesty, he is but an old man." Alden's gaze sliced through him like a blade. "Then he will learn obedience," he said coldly. The queen turned away, her eyes shimmering with unspoken fear. In that moment, a shadow passed over the golden floor, as if the light itself had grown a shape. By dusk, Elias was brought before the throne, surrounded by guards. Yet his face was calm, his steps steady. The king's voice thundered, "You defy my decree." The beggar bowed slightly. "I defy only your blindness," he replied. Silence fell heavy. Queen Maria gasped softly. Alden rose, his face red with rage. "You think a coin makes you wise?" Elias smiled faintly. "No, Majesty," he said. "But losing it will make you see." The hall seemed to tremble. Outside, thunder rolled across the horizon. The first warning of a storm. The hall fell silent after Elias's words. Even the torches seemed to burn more softly, as though afraid. King Alden stared at the beggar, unsure if he had heard defiance or prophecy. "You mock your king," he said, voice trembling with restrained fury. Elias only smiled. "No, Majesty. I remind you, the crown sits heavier on those who forget mercy." The words echoed like thunder against marble. Captain Thorne's grip on his sword tightened. Queen Maria closed her eyes, whispering a prayer under her breath. Alden rose slowly, stepping closer. "You will regret that tongue," he said. Yet in Elias's calm gaze, Alden saw something that unsettled him. Pity. Guards dragged Elias toward the dungeon, but he neither resisted nor spoke. "He doesn't fear," whispered one guard, uneasy. "He should." But as they descended into the damp corridors beneath the palace, Elias began humming softly, a tune no one recognized. It filled the narrow hall with an unsettling calm. Captain Thorne followed behind, unable to shake the feeling that they were the ones being judged. When the cell door slammed shut, Elias simply sat down and smiled. "Gold can build walls," he murmured, "but never peace." Above, the king stood by the window, staring into the darkening city, his own reflection flickering in the glass like a ghost. That night, King Alden could not sleep. He paced his golden chamber, haunted by the beggar's voice. "Gold can build walls, but never peace." He repeated it under his breath, as if trying to erase its meaning. Outside, thunder rumbled faintly, and the sound of rain on glass reminded him of coins falling. Queen Maria entered quietly, her face pale in the candlelight. "He speaks truth," she said softly. "You cannot buy sleep, Alden." The king turned sharply, his eyes fierce. "You side with him." She looked down. "I side with your soul." For the first time, Alden had no answer. At dawn, Alden descended into the dungeon himself. The torches burned low, smoke curling through the air. Elias sat exactly where he had been left, eyes closed, humming the same haunting melody. The king stopped outside the cell, trying to appear commanding. "You are stubborn," he said. "You could have lived in comfort if you obeyed." Elias opened his eyes, gentle and steady, "And die rich in emptiness." The king frowned. "You call me empty?" Elias nodded slowly. "Gold fills your vault, Majesty. But your heart, it echoes." The silence that followed cut deeper than any sword. When the king returned to the hall, his advisors waited eagerly with fresh reports of gold gathered from the last villages. But he no longer smiled at the sight. The coins that once shone like victory now all looked dull, lifeless. As the chests opened, he imagined Elias's calm face behind them. "Your Majesty," one advisor said, "the treasury is overflowing." Alden looked up, eyes distant. "And yet," he muttered, "why does my kingdom sound so quiet?" None dared to answer. Outside, the thunder rolled again, a sound of warning disguised as storm. Days passed, yet the king found no rest. His dreams were filled with rivers of gold turning into sand, slipping through his fingers no matter how tightly he grasped them. Each morning he awoke, drenched in sweat, his heart racing as if chased by something unseen. Queen Maria pleaded with him to free the beggar, but Alden refused. "He is nothing," he said. A liar, yet in his chamber mirror, he saw not a king but a hollow man wearing gold like armor against his own emptiness. The laughter of the poor outside his windows sounded mocking, and even the shining coins in his vault seemed to whisper his guilt. In the dungeon, Elias continued to hum his quiet melody. Word of the beggar spread among the guards. They said he never asked for food or water, only sunlight. Captain Thorne began visiting secretly, standing by the bars as Elias spoke gently. "You serve a king who has forgotten the people who built his throne," the beggar said softly. Thorne lowered his gaze. "I serve because I must." Elias smiled faintly. "Then one day you'll serve because you believe." That night, Thorne lingered outside longer than he should have, listening to the beggar's voice echo in the damp air, like truth rising from the dark. That evening, the king ordered a grand feast, perhaps to drown his unease in gold and wine. The hall filled with laughter, yet none of it reached his heart. Servant Lena watched silently from the corner, carrying platters too heavy for her small hands. She saw the king stare at the golden goblet before him as though it held poison. When the musicians began to play, their tune was eerily similar to the beggar's song. Alden froze, his eyes darting to the door. "Who taught you that melody?" he demanded. The hall went silent. The musicians trembled. No one answered. The king rose slowly, his face pale. Fear had found him. Late that night, Alden returned to the dungeon. This time alone. Rain poured outside, thunder shaking the stone walls. "You're infecting my kingdom with madness," the king hissed. Elias opened his eyes, calm as ever. "No, Majesty, your madness was there long before me. I only gave it a mirror." Alden gripped the bars, breathing heavily. "You think yourself wise?" Elias smiled. "No, Majesty, only free." The king's hands trembled. His rings clinked against the iron like small chains. For a moment, Alden thought he saw his reflection in the beggar's eyes, small, frightened, and goldless. At dawn, the king's vault doors burst open, a guard's panicked voice echoing through the palace halls. The gold was gone. Every coin, every jewel, vanished without a trace. Alden stormed in, eyes wild, clawing through empty chests as if they could speak. "Who did this?" he roared. No one answered. Even Captain Thorne stood silent. Then faintly, from somewhere deep below the palace, came that same haunting melody. Alden froze, his heart pounding. For the first time, he felt what he had never known before. Fear, not of loss, but of truth. The palace awoke in chaos. Guards ran through corridors, shouting orders, their armor clattering like thunder. King Alden stood in the center of his ravaged vault, trembling. "Find it," he growled. "Search every house, every street." Captain Thorne hesitated. "Majesty," he said carefully, "the people have nothing left to take." The king's eyes blazed. "Then someone has hidden my gold." He slammed his fist against a chest. The echo hollow. Queen Maria entered silently, her face pale. "Perhaps," she whispered, "it was never truly yours." Alden turned to her with fury and desperation. "Everything in this kingdom is mine." But even as he shouted, the walls around him felt smaller, tighter, like a tomb of his own making. By midday, the king's soldiers filled the streets, searching homes, tearing apart the market stalls. The people watched in silence, their faces gray with exhaustion. Servant Lena hid behind a broken fountain, clutching a loaf of bread she had stolen from the palace kitchens. She saw the fear in the eyes of children and the despair of mothers, and she whispered, "He's taking what isn't his." Overhead, dark clouds gathered once more. From the dungeon beneath, Elias's voice drifted faintly, not in words, but in song. Its tone was neither sorrow nor joy, but something deeper. A truth the storm itself seemed to carry. That night, the king visited the dungeon again, not to confront, but to beg. "Tell me," Alden said, his voice trembling. "Where is it? What have you done?" Elias looked at him kindly. Elias looked at him kindly. "I took nothing, Majesty. You lost what was never truly yours." The king gripped the bars, shaking them until his rings bent. "I will have your head," he cried. Elias smiled faintly. "You already wear its crown." The torches flickered violently as thunder roared above. For the first time, the king's voice broke into a whisper. "What are you?" Elias closed his eyes. A reminder. The next morning, Captain Thorne approached Queen Maria in secret. "Your Majesty," he whispered, "the people are starving. The king's madness grows. Soon, there will be revolt." The queen's eyes filled with tears. "Then we must free the beggar," she said softly. Thorne hesitated. "If he is freed, the king will kill us both." She smiled sadly. "Then let truth kill us, not greed." Together, they descended into the dungeon, hearts pounding. Elias looked up as they arrived, as if he had been waiting all along. "The storm has come," he said, "and with it, your chance to be free." When dawn broke again, Elias was gone. The dungeon door stood open, the lock untouched. Panic spread through the palace like fire. King Alden stormed through the corridors, shouting for answers. "How could he vanish?" he roared. No one could meet his eyes. Outside, the city lay silent, too silent. As Alden stepped onto the balcony, a strange sight met him. The streets glittered with gold dust scattered by the wind, but no people, only silence. broken by the faint echo of that same haunting melody drifting from somewhere unseen. The king's crown slipped from his head, rolling across the marble floor, and in that ringing silence, he finally felt the weight of his own emptiness. The palace was no longer alive with song or servants. Only echoes filled its golden halls. King Alden wandered barefoot through the corridors, the once bright tapestries now heavy with dust. His crown lay abandoned where it had fallen. Queen Maria had fled to the countryside with the people, unable to watch the kingdom die of hunger. Alden called her name, but only silence answered. In the emptiness of his throne room, he saw himself reflected 1,000 times in the gold around him, a lonely man trapped inside his own greed. "What happens when a king rules only over silence?" he whispered. For the first time in his life, there was no answer, and no one left to listen. In the city below, the people began to rebuild, without their king. Farmers tilled the earth again, and mothers shared what little they had. Servant Lena moved among them, carrying water, her once frail hands strong from labor. "We are poor," she said to a child, "but not empty." The beggar had vanished, but his song remained. It was sung softly in the markets, hummed in the fields, passed from voice to voice like a prayer. And though none had seen Elias since that night, they felt his presence in every act of kindness, as if truth itself had taken root in their hearts. King Alden left the palace before sunrise, wearing a simple cloak. No guards, no servants followed him. He walked barefoot through the mud, his jeweled fingers stripped bare. The people saw him and turned away, some in anger, others in pity. "Forgive me," he murmured to no one. The road led him to the forest beyond Valmere, where the air smelled of rain and pine. There, in the shadow of an old oak, he found a small wooden hut, the one he had once ordered, burned years ago for being too close to the royal lands. Smoke curled from its chimney. Someone was inside. He entered the hut slowly. Inside, the air was warm, and a fire crackled gently. There sat Elias, the beggar, stirring a small pot of soup. "You shouldn't be here," Alden said weakly. Elias looked up smiling. "And yet, here you are." The king fell to his knees. "I have lost everything," Elias nodded. "Then you're ready to learn what cannot be taken." The old man handed him a bowl. The soup was simple, roots, herbs, and water, yet when Alden tasted it, he felt tears fill his eyes. "It's enough," he whispered. Elias smiled softly. "Enough is where wealth begins." For 3 days, Alden remained in the hut. He spoke little, only listened. Elias taught him how to gather wood, boil water, and share food without measure. "Gold divides," Elias said, "but giving multiplies." On the 3rd morning, Alden woke to find the hut empty. A single golden coin lay on the table, glimmering in the sunlight. On its surface, a simple engraving, a crown broken in half, and beneath it, one word. "Enough." Alden closed his eyes, smiling through tears. He stepped outside into the forest, the song of birds echoing the beggar's melody. For the first time, he felt light, not from gold, but from peace. King Alden walked back toward Valmere with no escort, no crown, and no fear. The forest path glowed beneath the rising sun, each leaf sparkling with dew, as though the earth itself rejoiced at his rebirth. When he reached the city gates, the guards didn't recognize him. His beard was overgrown, his robe simple. "I seek no throne," he said softly. "Only forgiveness." They let him pass without a word. The streets were alive again. Merchants trading bread, children laughing, the sound of life returning. Alden smiled faintly. The same kingdom that once trembled before him now thrived without, and that somehow brought him peace. The king wandered through the markets where gold once ruled. Now trade was simple. Bread for fruit, cloth for candles. He saw Lena carrying a basket of apples, smiling as she handed one to a child. When she saw him, her eyes widened in shock. "Majesty," she whispered. Alden shook his head. "Just Alden," tears welled in her eyes. "You've changed." He nodded. "So has the kingdom." She handed him an apple. "Take it," she said. "You look hungry." The former king accepted it with trembling hands. The fruit was small, imperfect, yet it felt heavier than all the gold he'd ever held. As the days passed, Alden began to help where he could. He carried water for the old, chopped wood for the cold, and mended roofs with trembling hands unused to labor. At first, people whispered, unsure whether to hate or forgive. But when they saw him working silently beside them, the whispers faded into gratitude. "You were our king," an old woman said, handing him a bowl of soup. "I was your burden," he replied. She smiled. "Now you are our brother." That night, sitting by the fire, Alden realized that for the first time he ruled nothing, yet possessed everything. One evening, as Alden rested by the riverbank, he heard a familiar sound, the soft melody of Elias's song. He followed it, his heart racing until he reached the edge of the forest. There, by the water's edge, stood a figure in a tattered cloak, back turned. "Elias," Alden called. The figure didn't move. When he stepped closer, he found no man, only a wooden flute resting on a stone, still humming from the wind's breath. Alden smiled through tears. "You've taught me enough," he whispered. The river carried the melody away, and the setting sun painted the sky in gold, the kind that could never be stolen. When Alden returned to Valmir, the people gathered in the square. No guards, no banners, only faces full of quiet respect. "We have no king," one man said. "Then you are free." The queen, hearing the commotion, stepped forward from the crowd. Time had softened her sorrow. She reached for his hand. "You finally found it," she whispered. "True wealth," he nodded, eyes glistening. Together they looked toward the rising sun. The kingdom had no gold, no crown, but laughter filled its streets again. Proof that peace, once lost, had been reborn. Years passed. The golden palace that once towered above Valmir now served as a shelter for orphans and travelers. King Alden, now gray-haired and gentle, spent his mornings tending to the garden that bloomed where his vault had once stood. Flowers grew from the soil that once held greed, their colors more radiant than gold. Children ran through the corridors that had once echoed with fear. "Majesty," a young boy said one day, "were you ever rich?" Alden smiled softly. "Once," he said, "I was the poorest man alive." The boy laughed, not understanding. But the king's eyes shone with peace, the kind only loss can teach. Queen Maria often watched him from the balcony, her eyes filled with quiet pride. The man she once feared had become the heart of the people. Together they walked through the markets, not as rulers but as helpers, planting seeds, feeding the hungry, and teaching children to read. One afternoon, Alden paused at the fountain in the square. The water flowed clear again. He could almost hear Elias's voice within its gentle rhythm. "Gold divides, but giving multiplies." Alden placed his hand over his heart and whispered, "And peace, once shared, never ends." As evening fell, Alden often sat by the riverside where he had once found the flute. The sound of the water reminded him of the beggar's melody, soft, eternal. Sometimes he spoke to the wind, believing Elias could still hear him. "You were right," he would whisper. "The heart's worth is not measured in what it holds, but in what it gives." On one such evening, as the sun set behind the trees, a golden light shimmered briefly on the river's surface, not from coins, but from the fading light of day. And Alden, closing his eyes, smiled as if the beggar had nodded one last time. When the king grew too weak to walk, he asked to be carried to the old throne room one last time. The walls were bare now, the floor swept clean. He looked around and smiled. "At last," he whispered. "It feels light." Lena, now grown, knelt beside him. "Majesty," she said softly, "what should we do with what remains?" Alden's voice was faint but clear. "Give it away. Let every child know that gold once ruled here, and it brought us nothing." As he closed his eyes, the wind swept through the open windows, scattering a few gold petals from the garden, his final crown. When King Alden passed, the kingdom did not mourn with tears but with songs. Bells rang, not for loss, but for gratitude. His body was laid beneath the great oak near the river, beside the stone where the flute once rested. On his grave, the people carved the same word that had changed his life: enough. Years later, when travelers asked about the man buried there, villagers would say, "He was the king who owned everything," and learned that peace was worth more. And when the wind blew softly through the valley, it carried a faint melody, the beggar's song, still teaching, still healing.